Okay, for this unit, we're really going to be focusing on leadership and what makes a good leader. But as far as literary, we're going to be focusing on dramatic irony and just irony in general. So for the next 6 weeks, we're going to look at various pieces, and we're going to read The Necklace, which is going to focus on dramatic irony, and we're going to be reading Oedipus Rex, which is a Greek play that we're going to look at dramatic irony, and we're going to look at leadership as well. So some of the things to ask yourself when we're going through some of these pieces is what does it take to make a good leader? And we might have, some real specifics. Each person might have a various opinion, but I bet we can come up with some common traits that we can agree on. So the play we're going to be reading is called Oedipus Rex, and it's a very, very old play. It was written around 441 BC by a guy named Sophocles, and you can tell from this image that it probably will have some gore to it. The one thing about Greek theater, just to kind of keep in mind, is you don't see that on stage. It's mentioned, but they spare the audience the gore. So we're going to try as a class. We're going to try to. You can't ignore some of the real tough situations that these characters are in and some of the harsh decisions they make. But we're going to be focusing more on the structure of the play. We're going to be focusing on Oedipus's leadership and Creon's leadership. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind. Okay, so anyway, back to Sophocles, who's the guy that wrote Oedipus Rex. This is where you're going to need to get out your folder, and you'll take some notes. You can make a whole new section that is just called Greek theater, or you can say leadership. Either one is fine. And I'm going to give you some notes over Greek theater, and then you're going to be going to your literary section. We're going to have 5 lit terms. So you have 2 different areas where you're going to need to put some notes. So this would go into your new folder called Greek theater or leadership. Like I said, either one is fine. And if you please write down Sophocles the playwright, and you can write down this as well. He lived in Athens, Greece. He produced, well over 100 plays, and we still have 7 of them. So we have historical record that he wrote more than the 7 that we have. But the 7 we have are all very, very troubling plays. They're tragedies, and you'll see why when you start reading it. Okay, so here's some other things you need to write down. Greek culture believed that anything was possible through human effort and reason. Well, Sophocles kind of turned that on his head, and he did the opposite in Oedipus Rex. And the play involves characters that are caught up in insolvable dilemmas, causing them to challenge their faith in the gods as well as humanity. Well, what happens is Oedipus's parents get a prophecy that they don't like, and so they try to change it. They go against the gods, and they try to fool the gods. Now, we've seen that before in the Odyssey. So they try to trick that up, and it does not work out well, and the prophecy still comes true. Unfortunately, very, very unfortunately comes true. So make sure you got that written down. And if you please write down, Oedipus Rex is one of the oldest, greatest tragedies. People know this play. It was written a heck of a long time ago, and it's still one that people read and we can relate to in many ways. But in order to understand Oedipus, you kind of need to know a little bit about Greek theater. Oedipus is part of a trilogy. There's Oedipus Rex, and then Oedipus at Colonus, and then the play called Antigone. Antigone is one that you'll be reading next year in your sophomore class. But we're going to read the first of the trilogy this year. So the Oedipus trilogy was performed as a celebration to Dionysus, the god of fertility and theater. And it was in a 3-day celebration. And the big 3 playwrights were usually there. And those playwrights were Sophocles, Euripides, and Aeschylus. So make sure you write down those guys. They were considered celebrities. People knew these guys, and people went to them. So it was a huge event. That was the entertainment. So we have movies and we have film festivals today. The people of Athens would go to the celebration to Dionysus, and they would go to all the theater events. And this is an example of a Greek theater, how it would be set up. Those of you guys who are in theater, you probably have taken theater classes. This might be a review for you as far as the terms go. The one that I do want you to really pay attention to, is the chorus. Because the chorus is a little bit different. A lot of times students will think chorus like in a song, which, that stems from a chorus in Greek theater, but the chorus in Greek theater is a little bit different. We'll get to that in just a moment. All right, so as far as Greek acting on that great stage, it was tough. It was really tough to do, and it's even more difficult for today's actors because there's not a lot of action, so to speak. It's a lot of talk about the action, and our audiences like to see stuff today. So today, modern actors struggle with that, and modern audiences can as well. We're a different audience. But back, 2,500 years ago, you had very, very skilled artists or actors, and some of the audiences were 20,000 to 60,000 people. That's historically, or that's what we have in the records. You had to be very well trained with your voice because you'll see here in a second, how huge the theater is or was. And you had to have very strong and very bold body movements because you had to have people in that very back row be able to see what the heck you're doing. So that's where those Greek masks come from, because you couldn't see their facial expressions. So they wear masks to show their facial expressions. And as far as clothing, they'd wear shoulder pads sometimes with big, drapery that goes over them to make them look bigger. They'd wear shoes with lifts in them so that they look taller. That wasn't uncommon at all. And sorry about that typo on this one. It would be like performing to a sold-out crowd at Yankee Stadium, and you wouldn't have a microphone. So, you had to project your voice, and people were watching. So, we're talking a pretty big old theater. So, this is a quote from a Greek theater scholar, and you don't have to write this down. I just thought it was kind of interesting. One of the most difficult things about directing Oedipus Rex is that they lack a lot of what we call dramatic action. The Greeks didn't show you much. They talk about what has happened, but show you very little. For example, you don't see Oedipus claw his eyes out, and that's part of the play. You hear about the aftermath. But we are spared the sight of it. We want to see it, and this is classic Greek theater. So that's going to be the trick. There's some pretty heavy things that happened in the play, but we're not going to get too distracted by that. Like I said, we're going to focus on the structure of the Greek play, and we're going to focus on leadership of Creon and Oedipus. But there's some pretty gory things that occur. But Greek theater would just talk about it and not show you. And the eyes are part of it. All right, so now if you could go to your lit term section, and I'm going to give you a few terms if you could write them down, please. The first one is tragedy. A tragedy is a serious drama with a protagonist who struggles to achieve one thing and is ultimately unable to attain it, failing deeply. Usually if you're trying to figure out if it's a tragedy or comedy just don't necessarily have to be funny, but they have a happy ending. Tragedies have a sad ending. That's typically the way you can figure out if it's a comedy or tragedy. Just look at the ending. Tragic flaw is a weakness that the protagonist has, leading to his or her downfall. And so that's kind of a generic term for, what is it? Kind of like we say Achilles' heel. In Greek theater, it would be considered the tragic flaw. And more specifically, it's called hamartia. Hamartia is the Greek term meaning to miss the mark, the tragic flaw causing the downfall. So if we would say Oedipus had a tragic flaw, I would look at you and say, okay, so what is his hamartia? What's his one thing that really screwed him up? And you might come back and say, what's his hubris? His hubris got in the way. So tragic flaw is kind of a generic term. Hamartia narrows it down, and then if you say hubris, it's even more specific. Okay, so in Greek theater, you had something called the chorus. I mentioned that earlier. And the chorus was basically a group of people who spoke the minds of what they would consider the society. People who were like maybe part of the crowd, like Oedipus is, the king, and he's talking to the citizens of Thebes. Well, the chorus would reflect the citizens of the Thebes. And it's usually played by a group of people. And you can see these guys are wearing robes. That's how this director did it, wearing robes, and they all have masks on. Again, that's a Greek theater thing, is the masks. And so there are a couple of different parts. There's a strophe. They chant almost. Okay, so the chorus is broken up into the strophe, which their chants recap what has happened and ask questions to the characters that have not been answered. Often it sounds like they're speaking their thoughts aloud. So when Oedipus or Creon or one of the characters says something, and they leave, they get off the stage, then the chorus might go, or the strophe might be like, what was that all about? Why is he choosing to do those things? And then the antistrophe comes back at them. and kind of offer some suggestions about maybe this is what he was thinking. So it'd be like you have a group of people representing the citizens of Thebes, and they're asking these questions. The antistrophe would be like the people who would try to answer those questions. My warning to you guys is when we're reading these are going to be those long passages that we're just going to have to take a deep breath, and we're going to have to get through. They're not always easy to get through because, again, there's not a lot of action. So we'll do it, though. We'll get through it just fine. So one of the challenges about Oedipus Rex is that people knew this story. It's very similar to like Romeo and Juliet. We all pretty much know Romeo and Juliet. So as a director, how are you going to do things that are a little bit different? So people went into the play knowing what was going to happen. And that's part of that dramatic irony. And we kind of assume that people know, like we'll take Romeo and Juliet. We assume most people know that they're going to die at the end. So how is that director going to make it different for the audience? And for Romeo and Juliet, we've seen things like it's set in California with the Leonardo DiCaprio version of the 1990s. More recently, there was a version that was set like in a zombie kind of setting. But we, as an audience, knows what's going to happen. So that's that dramatic irony part to it. Same thing with Oedipus Rex. Their audience knew, the horrible things that are going to happen. Now, it might be new to us because a lot of you might not know the story of Oedipus Rex. But their audience knew this stuff. So the director had to figure out like a different take of it. So this is just an image that I just think is interesting that kind of represents maybe what we're going to expect. And so you've got some pretty tough colors going on. The red is pretty brilliant. It kind of reflects maybe some harshness. Some people will say it looks almost like blood, and maybe by the eyes it looks like flowers, and you see the sticks coming out of the eyes. And so you kind of get a feel for what Oedipus Rex is going to be like. So if you would, now that you've listened to the lecture and you have taken some notes over it, there's a quiz waiting for you on Canvas. So if you'd go ahead and take that and show that you understand the different aspects that we need to know for Greek theater, I'd appreciate it, and that will be due as soon as possible. Thank you very much.